Scott County, providing safe, healthy, and livable communities.
Then I'd like to introduce Chris Harder, our Quality Improvement Manager, who's going to lead us in our Scott County Delivers program for this month. So, Chris, take it away.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Commissioners. This morning we're going to talk about economic development, and certainly we all share an interest in our communities and our citizens being economically viable and thriving. And I think that folks that put together the materials today did a very nice job of laying out how the board has considered economic development like over the last 10 years and planned for that, and in some ways really credited you for some of the progress that has been made in that area. In a couple weeks, we're going to start talking about new board strategies and new priorities. And so as you're hearing the material today, we hope that you'll consider how this information helps you in planning as we go forward on transportation and land use and job creation, all those topics. We'll be certainly talking about them more over the next couple weeks in those workshops. I think we want to talk a little bit about how do we as government create the right environment for jobs. And I think the panel's got a nice amount of detail about that today, so that'll be helpful to hear. And we're also interested if there are other places where you need more information about these topics as we go into those planning workshops, and we'll be happy to collect that in the interim. The only last piece I'll say is that housing is certainly a part of economic development. The Scott County Delivers conversation next month is specific to housing and homelessness. And so we're going to talk a little bit about housing today, but largely we're going to save that for next month. So just so you're aware of that, that piece. With that, I think I'd like the panel to introduce themselves first, please.
I'm Danny Lenz, Deputy County Administrator.
Jen Schwartz, Health and Human Services.
Steve Jones, Office of Management and Budget.
Brad, where you go?
Sure, Brad Davis, Planning and Resource Management Director.
Carrie Ouimet, Economic Assistance Director.
Lisa Fries, Transportation Services Director.
Perry Mulcron, Enterprise Business Technology.
Cindy Geis, Community Services Director.
Stacy Crakes, I'm the Business Development Director with the Scott County CDA.
Barb Dahl, Social Services Director, Health and Human Services.
And Barb, I think you're going to do just a quick overview, a few minutes, and then Jen's going to start out our questions this morning.
Actually, I think you did a great job with you.
Did I take your stuff? Sorry.
Yeah, no, we're pleased to be here today. I think we've had a lot of good success as it relates to economic development, and as the packet indicates, we've seen significant job growth in recent years, but that didn't happen overnight. I think that took decades of planning and strategic investments that got us to this point. So today we're hoping that this conversation can be a little reflective and celebratory on what we've achieved, while also looking to engage in a conversation about what we need to do as we move forward. I think as we were trying to look at what does the scope of economic development mean for this conversation, and for the purposes of this presentation, I think we started looking at how much really does it impact all of what we do. I think it can be pretty far-reaching when you look at the goal of Scott County to have safe, healthy, and livable communities, and even the vision of Live, Learn, Earn, which is to have stable and to have individuals that are stable, educated, connected, and contributing. And then I looked also at we have really important partners with the cities that have played a really critical role in making sure that we've gotten to this point. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, we want to look at business and workforce development, land use such as planning and zoning and tax incentives, infrastructure, transportation, fiber, and housing. And to Chris's point too, we don't want to go into a deep dive on housing, but did want to highlight that there's some gaps that we're concerned about, especially as it relates to our labor force and our ability for employers to attract and retain the quality workforce that they need. And I think just one more point that I think we want to make before we turn it back over is that I think during a time when we have, at our federal level, we have like looming deficits. We know at a state level we've seen county cost shifts that happen either intentionally or inadvertently this is potentially one area that allows us to control our own destiny. So are there ways that, of course, we can create the conditions, as Chris said, that allow for that economic prosperity to continue and really allow us to achieve our mission in the long run? So that will turn it over.
Thanks.
Okay, we'll start on page 24. It's kind of a big umbrella question, but one of the biggest challenges that I see in this is in the coming years will be the aging population, more retired folks and less available for work. What do we do as a county to prepare for this?
So we actually are one of the youngest counties statewide, and really our numbers, if you look at this slide, and then also if you look at slide 22 on the growth in our population, even though the growth has been in our over 55-year-old area, if you actually look at the same chart on a statewide level, it's actually negative for growth in that area. So I think we have an opportunity, and especially with some of the great work that a lot of our school districts have been doing with, say for example, the city of Shakopee or Shakopee Public Schools with their sector-based programming and their academies. It really provides an opportunity that how do we hook our youth up with local opportunities and really create that business to education partnership that allows for some of that pipelining to occur. I think no doubt we're going to have a labor shortage for now and into the future, but are there strategies around trying to keep our local youth local?
I'll continue on for page 22. Like you said, this is showing the overall growth over the past decade, and it is showing the greatest growth in the older ages. What do you feel are the biggest obstacles from keeping the younger ages from coming here?
I mean, one piece is housing, like we highlighted at the beginning here. I think after just meeting with a couple employers last week and even engaging in a Scott County conversation with some of our managers here, I think it's a struggle with how are we going to be able to maintain and attract people without having some housing options for individuals kind of across that spectrum. So that's one potential challenge. I think also we've looked to and talked a lot about post-secondary options here within the county, and having something like that local that allows us to train a workforce that helps meet the needs of our local employers is going to be important for us, and can potentially be a way to attract local youth here as well, or at least working age adults.
And just to add on to that, if you look at page 32, particularly those kids that are coming out of college and out of the universities, when they're coming to an area where they want to locate and start building their career path, starting a family, they also want some level of affordability. And as you can tell within this grid, the availability of houses at that entry level area is just minimal at best. And the ones that do come on the market generally get stuck in a bidding war. So if folks have the ability to come in and pay cash, that they're going to get the house much more frequently than these kids who need financing. So just to kind of piggyback on what Barb has said, is that not only is the availability of housing and the affordability, but how long does it stay on the market to allow them to be competitive, to be able to acquire some living quarters.
And what do you see the county's role in that?
Well, as you know, and most everybody else knows, that the biggest amount of development, particularly at the entry-level home, is going to be within the municipalities. So I think all that we can do is kind of work collectively with the municipalities and some of the developers and strategically try to plan out and help them with identifying areas where we could collaborate and partner on some level of entry-level homes. It's difficult in this community because, again, we are a very affluent county and our prices for land are extremely high. So how we can make that work is really going to be we need to have that conversation with our cities in order to partner. Our townships, and Brad could probably speak more to this, it's really difficult to be able to build these types of homes in the townships because land is just so expensive. And depending upon how close they want to be to freeway access, particularly if they're a young professional, most of them want some way and ease to get to work. And of course, along those corridors, is where your land values are really going to be exorbitant in the prices.
Maybe I'd just add too, from the perspective of the CDA, we do work with a lot of different cities, and as these different workforce housing type projects come up, the CDA is approached by developers looking at constructing those types of projects throughout the county. They have to go through a process where they apply for tax credits, and it's a very competitive process. Where the CDA has helped with that on behalf of the entire county is to step in and help with some gap financing or some long-term loans to help move some of those projects forward. So thankfully, we have seen some, some good projects come through in the last couple of years that are now being built or are just starting to be built. But there's still a demand that we need a lot more than what we have and what we are building right now.
So for me, on the other side of achieving our goal of 50 by 30 is not just bringing in new residents, but also getting our residents to stay here. When we look at slide 26, it talks about the resident job skills versus the available local jobs gaps. And what I see in a number of these areas, these aren't the types of firms that always, depending on the area, move locations very frequently. They usually set up somewhere and then kind of stay there as the business comes to them. What are we doing to try and target these areas to see our local employers or local businesses grow in these areas? So professional services, finance, insurance, real estate. What are we doing to help them grow and become bigger, and maybe even manufacturing as well?
I can comment on that. Some of the things that there's a number of different things that we're doing. One is that the businesses that we have here, in some of our communities, we're going out and doing business retention and expansion visits. So we're trying to understand what their needs are, what their growth expectations are. If they're not expected to grow, why not? What do they need to be, more viable in the county? So having that understanding of what the business needs are and how we can better connect them maybe within the county is one of those areas that we're working on. Some of the other things that we're doing is some dedicated outreach. We're trying to market the county better because there seems to be a perception among brokers and agents that Scott County is the destination for basically transportation or just the big box, warehousing. And that's not necessarily what fits with our current residents. So how do we overcome that perception with the brokers and have them, when they're working with their clients, do a better job of recommending that they consider Scott County potentially to tap into the workforce that we have here?
And then to follow up, are we doing any tracking of, as we're making these outreaches or targeting these particular areas for growth and looking at how successful our programs are and actually adding jobs or bringing in those specific areas?
So at the First Stop Shop, which is part of the Scott County CDA, we have a database where we track wins. And we're tracking them for all of the cities at the end of each year, even the wins that we're not involved with. We still try and track through our database so that we can refer back to it and see where we're growing, where we're not, where we might want to do a little more targeting. So we do have information on that. It's not complete by any means, but we try and do the best that we can with the information that we have.
Another county program that we have that probably closed the gap in the manufacturing part of that graphic is our economic gardening program, where we are trying to grow some of our smaller businesses that have made it past the growth stage. They're poised for more growth. We want to provide them the information, the research, so they can make further investments in their business, and usually that includes hiring more people. And so for 5 or 6 years, we've supported maybe 14 to 16, maybe now more, maybe we're up to about 20 different businesses that have kind of made that second stage growth. It helped them provide the resources. We asked them later, how many more people did you add to the payroll? We know that it's been an increase for most of those companies. And most of them have been in that manufacturing. We've had a couple of professional service businesses as well in that. And so that's just kind of one more example where I think we're trying to grow the businesses that are already here. It's not all about attracting new businesses, but it's growing what we already have.
On page 37, the tax abatements. I guess I'm wondering, what does this graph tell you? And then is there other data that the county tracks that shows the outcomes from tax abatements? So whether they're good for us or not?
I'll speak to this one. We do a multitude of tracking, through the act that they have to report on, they only have to do it for 3 years until they hit compliance. But with our contracts that we have, now remember, economic development abatements are optional for the county. The county board has to decide whether they're gonna partner with the school in the city or just the city, or whether they're gonna decline to partner at all. Very unlike tax increment financing, which we don't really have an option of. But these are 3 of the companies that they have made that decision that they were going to contract with the city and partner with them on providing some economic assistance to make these companies, or allow these companies to come into Scott County. Now, what this graph shows on page 37 is what was our anticipated value increase, our tax base increase that the county was expecting. We do know that the taxes that are collected off of this increase in value for a period of time get refunded after they're paid back to the city, who then refunds the company for their investment in Scott County. Most of those are between a 6 to a 9-year abatement period. And after that, that added tax stays within each of the local governments that it would be settled to otherwise. The other types of things that we do collect on abatements is the number of jobs. So what we ask the companies every year to provide job growth that they've had. And not only just the job growth, but we want to know what's the level of wage that you're also paying. And so between 2017 and 2018, we had 569 jobs that were created in 2017, 799 jobs in 2018. And that in and of itself is a very large number, but we're looking for is livable wage jobs primarily. The jobs that are paying $14, $15, $16 an hour may be decent jobs for people who are wanting to bring in supplemental income, but they can't afford to live on that. So in order to come and just make that type of wage, what other types of county incentives are we going to need to provide? Are we going to need to provide some economic assistance in order for them to still live here? So what we're looking at is over the $30 range in 2017, there was 356 jobs created, and now in 2018, there's 440. So that number is going up, the trend is up, which is great. We know that this is a point in time. They report to us every May. And one of our staff gathers this information and just continues to track it for the county for 2 purposes. One, so that we can make sure that our citizenship and our county board knows that the investments that they have decided to go forward with are the outcomes are being gained. But the last thing is that we want to make sure that the businesses are in compliance with their contract. Because if they fall out of compliance, then that's a conversation between the board and the city in cooperation with possibly even the schools to have a conversation about whether or not we continue to go forward with this contract or whether or not we should try to get out of it.
Now, continuing down the jobs path here, moving over to page 18, looking at the overall job growth, Scott County has seen significant growth in jobs. And knowing that we have the tax abatements, we also have the economic gardening, do we have a breakdown of how much is from new business and how much is from the growth in existing businesses in Scott County?
So with the projects that we've tracked in our system, we could pull that information to some extent. We don't necessarily have the amount of investment and all of the jobs numbers for every project that's come to Scott County, but we do have it for a fair number of them. So we can do some estimates on what's new versus what was here and growing. And I feel like through the assessor's office, they might be able to help with some of the data that they have where we could potentially see that as well. But we don't have that on hand, at least right this second.
And with the assessor's office, as you know, anytime that a new business comes in and they want to either expand or whether that not they just want to actually move here for the very first time, they have to take out a permit. So we would know new businesses that moved in, whether they're commercial, and even the type, right? Are they industrial type of businesses? Are they commercial type of businesses? Are they just frontline retail? We can get those numbers, but we would never have the employment numbers that go with it. But working in tandem maybe with First Stop Shop, we could try to put that data together for future.
Just as kind of a point of clarification on the job growth piece, are there one or two things, you folks have access to really a lot of data, and it sounds like multiple databases and cross-system databases. Are there one or two things that are most important to you to pay attention to? Like, what are the one or two markers that you are looking at?
That's a good question. I think ultimately, I think there's a couple things, right? Like we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the 50 by 30 piece because of that's been important part of what sales put forward and a lot of the direction and kind of infrastructure around what we're doing to move forward. But at the same time, I think there's a desire just to make sure that we're kind of fulfilling the mission of the county or live, learn, earn, and really how well are people doing when it's all said and done. And so I think looking at that average wage amount, looking at the data that's on maybe page 25 and looking at the industries that we have here, how many jobs are attached to those industries and what are the average wage for those industries, along with potentially other community indicators such as what's the average cost per round. Like if you live here and you work here, how does that feel? And are you able to do that well?
Okay.
I think those are some other pieces that I think we take into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Speaking about wages a little bit on, I believe it's page 27, and then also 28 to a little bit, but if you look at, 2015, 2016, 2017, we're significantly above in our average wage for this program than our target. Do you have any information on what's driving us to be so much higher? I mean, I think it was like 46% higher than what the wage target is.
I can speak to just kind of like the program itself and the focus of the program, which I think definitely contributes to that. That is kind of in part due to the folks that we're serving within the program. The dislocated worker, those are individuals that have been laid off due to no fault of their own. And we certainly serve a wide array of individuals from entry-level workers up to executive-level workers. They tend to be, though, more mid-level to higher paid jobs that we are, seeing come through the door, and we are, one of our goals that isn't reflected here is to try to match to some level the wage that they left. So we are trying to place them at a similar level wage, of course, for, a variety of reasons. But there's also a real heavy focus on training and retraining in this program. So the program is funded to be able to retrain folks, and sometimes, we're serving individuals that have been in their same jobs in their career for 20, 30, upwards of 30 years and are looking for a career change. Or maybe they just need some professional development certifications to take them to the next level. And the program is funded to be able to support the folks in that way. And so we have really seen great success due to some of that.
And then the target that's set, is that how is that target set?
It is set, they look at the economic conditions across the state, and it's also, they try to match the federal target that's set based on the region. And so when we're looking at, conditions in different parts of Minnesota that, wouldn't, that might not result in a wage that you could get in the metro area, they're kind of taking that average.
So this is localized then to a certain extent?
It's localized to Minnesota, so it's the same target for the state of Minnesota.
Okay.
So, everybody across the state has the same target. So we're looking at conditions from all across the state and taking that average.
Right.
Carrie, do you have data, as you were talking about trying to match salaries that for people who have lost jobs, do we have data about how often does that happen or not happen?
We do. I don't have it available today, but we
That's
do.
okay.
That is measured within the program.
Okay, thanks.
And then on page 29, kind of following up from those previous questions, we have the 3-year self-support index. And looking at the why does it matter, it says we're looking at if they have I'm working an average of 30 hours per week or off-cash assistance 3 years after the baseline data was collected. Does this tie to the same program and data that we have for these higher wage jobs that we're seeing people get?
Sure, it actually doesn't. So the self-support index is reflective of our public assistance program, so the Minnesota Family Investment Program. So those are families that are receiving public assistance. They have one or more dependent children in the cash food childcare assistance program. So when they exit the program, that is when their baseline starts, and this measures whether or not they've stayed off and or are working that number of hours 3 years after they've left.
All right. Do you have any information as why we're so successful? These last 3 measures I was just reading through these are great stories to tell. Is there any information on why we're always above that upper limit even?
Yeah, I think a lot of this really speaks to the work that the staff does, and we are unique here in that our employment and training staff and our income maintenance staff work really, really closely to make sure that the folks have the benefits they need timely. They're getting all of the services that they're eligible for, which in larger counties isn't even possible. So we're really lucky here to be able to have that collaboration. I think, helping somebody exit the program with as many tools and as much support as they need plays a big role in that. But it's also complicated because we don't necessarily get the data. When we get our self-support index numbers, we don't necessarily know who exactly is included in that. And so we can look more generally across the folks that we've served and run some other reports. But if we wanted to look at individual, a year in total or by quarter, we don't receive that data. So I wish we did, because I think we would be able to follow some things a little more closely.
Thank you.
On page 33 around transit, I'm just curious, how do we maximize this, so the passengers per hour, how do we work to improve that? And then also, what does the subsidy per passenger tell you?
Well, at the regional level, they do look at routes and how they're performing. And oftentimes, the factors that go into that subsidy, to that part of the question, are, how many passengers are actually picking up and serving along that corridor. A lot of that has to do with employment density or housing density where that route runs. And this looks at our 2 routes that I would call local circulator routes in Scott County. They're the 497 and the 499. They're run by MVTA. Prior to the merger, they were run by Scott County Transit. And so the west route serves the Shakopee Mall and the downtown area from Marshall Road. It's kind of Marshall Road's the hub. And then the other route, 499, goes to the east and serves Amazon, Southbridge, Dean Lakes, and that area. So those routes really, a function of how fast people can travel on those routes. They make decisions about whether to ride them or not, whether it goes to locations that they need to go to, or it's within walking distance to where they need to go to, or if they can connect to another route. The 495 brings a lot of folks in from other points outside of the county, and these routes then are kind of the feeder from that point at Marshall Road where they drop folks off. So all of those things kind of play into how well the route performs. Subsidy really gets at, and most of the local suburban routes perform, I think the average at the regional level was $14.82 per passenger. So that's the actual subsidy for that passenger on average. They perform at a much lower, a much higher rate of subsidy than intercity bus routes or even light rail, but that's a function of how many people they serve and if you really look at the characteristics of the areas that they serve. So this is a peer comparison, so they'll be comparing those local suburban routes throughout the metro area in other parts of the metro, not just Scott County.
So what kinds of things do you look at? You talked about the different things that influence it. What do you look at to try and improve that then? What?
Well, MBTA just retooled these routes when the merger happened, and some of the things that they did was, we used to go into the shopping centers, and now what they tried to do is they have set up bus stops adjacent to the shopping centers so that they could keep the bus routes moving more rapidly. So that was one thing that they looked at to try to improve performance. I think it's had mixed results. The routes that were predominantly shopping center oriented, our ridership went down, and the routes that were more employment oriented, the ridership went up. It kind of depends on the characteristic of the route. The other thing that goes on is that you could adjust the route corridor if there's a development that's adjacent to it that goes in that has some density that needs to be served, like senior housing or an employment center. But oftentimes those routes don't get adjusted greatly. The other thing we can do to improve route performance is improve people's ability to get to the route. If you look at our suburban routes and you walk what is considered to be a normal walking distance from that route, which is like a quarter to a half mile, you'll often find that a lot of the city streets and even some of our county roads are lacking pedestrian facilities, and they're not maintained during the wintertime, so that's a deterrent for ridership. So all of those things together need to be looked at and considered and improved to optimize ridership on these routes.
Does the county have a say in that, or on the choices MBTA makes?
We do. We participate in the technical committee.
Okay.
So do the cities. Commissioner Ulrich is on the board, so we do have a say in how those changes are made. And I think we have a lot of influence in terms of how, the cities have in particularly a lot of influence on how things change by how they continue to evolve in their development.
On these routes, have we seen ridership going up as people are more familiar with the routes over the last, I know we only have to 2017, but looking at monthly numbers or something, are we seeing improvements in their?
In particular, the 499 route has improved, the 497 route not so much. So there has been some improvements over time. Ridership overall, both in Scott County and in the region on these kinds of routes has actually dropped because of lower gas prices and people making choices. So it's a little hard to be precise yet. We probably have to have a longer data series to be able to figure that out.
And then you talk about lower performing routes are to be evaluated for restructuring or possible elimination. What's our time frame for this route to perform better before we have another change or possible elimination?
Well, I think it's the review of these routes occur monthly and annually. At the region, they occur annually. These routes are funded through regional funds, and so there becomes, if routes continue to perform poorly, there's choices that MVTA will make within their routes that they have about whether to subsidize this route or to change this route out or eliminate this route. In fact, they just went through some changes that predominantly affected our express routes in the county to downtown Minneapolis, where they did adjust the services. So that occurs usually on an annual basis, and I'm sure the conversation at the region, if routes continue to perform poorly, will impact how MVTA gets their funding through the Met Council.
Lisa, can I ask a question from the next page, from page 34? I'm just wondering, as we talk about transportation being part of the infrastructure for economic development and job growth and like how people move around the county to get to and from work, like what do you see as the capacity, like in the current system, like what's the capacity to move people, to move goods? You know, I'm thinking about like the 10-ton carrier capacity. Like how well are we positioned for transportation to support economic growth?
I think the county has made, over the past 2 to 3 decades, some really great strides in getting the infrastructure in place to support economic development. It's the one area that we really do have an ability to make a direct investment in something that can support economic development. Over the time that I've been here, and even prior to that, we've worked hard at developing the grid system to support the communities in the north that are urbanizing at a rapid pace, and build 2 to 4 lane road conversions to support that growth. We have, in previous Scott Delivers presentations, we've showed you the 10-ton roadmap and the change over time, and we've made significant strides countywide on improving the 10-ton road system through the board's investment, not only in expansion projects and reconstruction projects, but also through our ongoing preservation program, where we look at roads and evaluate them and design our overlay program such that we improve those roads to 10-ton capacity. And I believe now on our county road system, for the most part, we're probably at 90% of our roads being 10-ton capacity, and that's good because it supports the movement of freight countywide. It supports our farm community, it supports our manufacturing that are in some of our smaller communities, and as well the northern developing and urbanizing communities.
Okay.
So I think they've really made a good effort. And this map here really pretty much shows that if you look at the investments that we have planned in transportation, that by 2040, if we pursue all of them, the county road system's in pretty good shape. The road system that tends to have some capacity issues to support development appears to be the state's trunk highway system. Highway 13, the river crossings, all show congestion.
Have we looked at not just road improvements, but public transit options on some of these areas that we see being congested to try and move some of that traffic a different way than just road expansions and redesign?
Well, in particular, we had a major effort along the 169 corridor study to look at mobility on that corridor and ways that we could enhance that. It was a study done jointly with Met Council and MnDOT, and we looked at several prong attack to that, including bus advantages, improving bus advantages on the 169 corridor in Scott County and all the way to downtown Minneapolis through a transit way, as well as MnPass. So we have been looking at those corridors. Trunk Highway 13 is another example where we've looked at how to improve transit, and as a part of the 13 and 101 project, we actually had the foresight that there might be a transit line like the 495 going in there, and we put in a transit advantage shoulders on that corridor through that improvement. So we continue to monitor and try to stay ahead of those things.
One of the things we learned a few years ago when we invited a lot of real estate brokers and agents down to look at our top 10 corridors or intersections for economic development is that congestion really matters when it comes to site selection. Businesses do not want to locate on corridors that are congested today or projected to be congested. Their employers don't want to deal with that. They're trying to move goods up and down those corridors. They don't want those delays. So we would often talk about what's the traffic today in these areas, but for those site selectors, they were more curious about what's the future traffic volumes on these roads, because that really matters to where they're going to locate a future business.
And even they are even concerned not only with our roads, but also freeways, access to freeways, and getting to the interstate system, and that those sources or considerations are very important for these large businesses that are coming into Scott County.
Chris, I want to ask a quick question on that. Just because 13 through Prior Lake and all the issues we have there with the environment, and I think Belle Plaine is facing some development on the west. What does County Road 8's extension do to help our transportation system?
We did a little bit of testing this year with a comprehensive plan and the modeling effort that we went through. And if we make that connection, it has a significant impact on reducing congestion on 169 and on 13, because it now provides an option for people to get to 35W without having to go up Highway 13 or 169 and across the Bloomington Ferry Bridge. So it provides a pretty important connection, and it's one of those areas where I think we ought to be focusing and thinking about how do we win and how do we make that happen in the next planning period.
And Belle Plaine is facing some development there because of the interchange. Do they understand the importance of the flow and making sure that corridor moves as well?
I believe that the city staff understand the function of that roadway. I can't speak to the elected officials, but I think that my conversations with the city staff is that they do understand and see the importance of preserving that corridor and are trying to work collaboratively. But it's always difficult because those mining proposals and other development proposals come in those communities very incrementally, and so it's difficult to make transformative change, and so they really have to be thinking about each individual decision that they're making with those development proposals.
Perry, can we talk about the digital divide? So I'm looking at page 36.
Sure.
So it says that Scott County has the smallest digital divide in the state. Am I reading that right?
Correct.
And can you talk about, like, knowing that there's still some areas in Scott County that don't have access, can you talk about that rating and just kind of what goes into that?
Sure. So this slide is first I want to call it that there was a typo. The source is actually a 2017 study. Purdue has been tracking this for a number of years, and they're going to continue having this be an annual study across the country. It studies basically the available infrastructure, broadband availability in an area, and its social economic factors. So the people's ability to consume that technology, if the technology is available, but the population is such that they're not ready to consume it, then the divide would be bigger. So we have a unique crossroad in Scott County where our available broadband and our population's ability to consume it is in that sweet spot. So we have a very low divide. We still have so one thing that I've had discussions with rural townships about is they are, which might be is a later on slide, is they are hurting on available broadband. Even though we have a very fiber-rich environment, we're not getting the carriers to necessarily get out to the rural areas. Okay. But our population centers are on the north part where we're pretty well served. So that is swaying the numbers to be, where the divide overall for the county is low. And we are the lowest in the state. We're one of the lowest in the country, actually.
Speaking to what you're saying there, on slide 35, it shows the percent of households served by wireline broadband. What can the county do to help more of the rural areas that are at more of the 50% availability?
So that has been a new initiative that we've been tracking along with administration and the board is we're trying to create an environment from Scott County's perspective for the municipalities to be able to have a conversation directly with the providers. And kind of like roads is we want to leverage our Scott County fiber assets to encourage broadband development, which is good for education. It's excellent for development. It's excellent for just our quality of life. It's been shown to statistically really help businesses, small and medium and large businesses. It's been credited for helping bring like Shutterfly and Emerson and Amazon to the area as a factor that helped. So we're trying to create an environment, and our main way of doing that is through partnerships. So we created a partnership with Access Networks, and Access Networks helps facilitate a concept called open access. And that is, again, leveraging our fiber asset investment for middle mile, so that a provider could call and come and do business in Scott County, and rather they would work with carrier to carrier. So they would work with Access Networks, who is a provider, to help facilitate that over our middle mile fiber, if that makes sense. We're also creating conversations directly with those townships and encouraging providers to go and meet with the townships and have grassroots conversations, and that has started working in Spring Lake Township and Sand Creek Township and Blakely. We've started getting houses that haven't had broadband for years. They're starting to get broadband to the tune of 25 megabits download and 3 megabits upload, when they were only at like 256 and 512 upload and download.
I think one other thing that occurs too is that we formed a pretty good partnership with Perry's group, and when we do highway projects, we try to do what we can to facilitate the addition of fiber where it makes sense, and work with the groups that might be interested. Case in point is we're continuing to try to serve underserved businesses along the 169 corridor and facilitate, as we're constructing those projects, the ability for these providers to come in and work in the right of way to get that fiber to those businesses.
Nice. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, other questions?
So one I had, we talked a couple of times about the commercial and industrial demand and how we've tried to incorporate in that in our comprehensive plan update. But a lot of it's really dependent on the cities, and as they annex in, how are we working with the cities to try and facilitate that and having that commercial industrial zone land available?
Yeah, a couple of ways. I can start, probably Stacy has some thoughts, but a lot of our cities are starting to look at their future growth areas and recognizing that they're going to need to expand the city limits in order to bring in new areas for both residential growth but also commercial and industrial. So at the county, we work with the townships and the cities to look at orderly annexation agreements, maybe establishing them for the first time, like we've seen down in Jordan, St. Lawrence Township, or update their agreements like we've seen with Jackson and Shakopee, so that everyone kind of knows the staging and which parcels are likely going to be annexed first, and when is the city going to extend sewer, water, roads into those areas.
Sorry, that's slide 39 that I was at.
Sure. And so we try to put as much order to it as we can. It's still market driven, so that's ultimately what really starts the process, but we try to set the stage so that everyone knows generally when things are going to occur. The cities have been updating their long-range plans to show which areas are good for commercial, industrial use, or office use. The city of Shakopee has a whole new vision for the area around the 16941 interchange, and so they will want to see that type of development over time located into that area. So that's one example, but I'm sure Stacy has some examples through the CDA TAP grant.
Well, so one of the things that the CDA does is every 5 years, they'll do a housing study update and then also a commercial industrial update. And that information is shared with all of the cities. There's certain recommendations for each of the cities to consider. Anything new, like in the city of Shakopee, would be incorporated into the next update. So the last one was done in 2017. The beginning of 2017 is when it came out for the commercial industrial. So I would expect that we would look at doing that again in 2021 or so. And we Through our EDI grants, our Economic Development Incentive Grants that the CDA offers, we try and give priority to projects that look at how do we do things that opens up more commercial industrial land and moves it closer to being shovel-ready. So we work closely with the county and the city to try and identify what those areas are, what those projects are, and where it makes the most sense to kind of focus at the time.
For some of these areas that we've identified, what is the condition of the utilities and the infrastructure in there? Not just roads, but the other utilities that would need. And are the cities talking about making sure that those are at a level where it would encourage commercial industrial that require a different type and capacity for those utilities?
Well, we've inventoried all of the parcels that are guided or zoned for commercial and industrial development and made a determination if they're pad ready, and we had some criteria to establish if they're pad ready, meaning that all the utilities are there, the road is there, really the need is just to put up a building and they're ready to go. So that was the kind of our class 1 pad ready site. So we inventoried all of the parcels around the county that fit that description. Then we went to a class 2 where there's a little more extension of a road or a sewer to get to that parcel. And finally class 3 was really maybe 10, 15 years out. So that was a useful exercise for all of us because we quickly realized that we had very few pad-ready sites in the county about 2-3 years ago, and that's really what prompted the cities to work with the CDA to think about how do we get more pad-ready sites onto the market. We had a broker's day at Canterbury Park a few years ago, and we distributed maps of all of our cities and townships and where the pad-ready sites are located, and tried to promote that if you want to come down, we're ready to do business, but unfortunately, we don't have a lot of large sites left. I think at the time we had maybe 1 or 2 parcels that were pad ready over 40 acres. So again, we need to really focus on that as the cities, figuring out where we can open up more areas, get the utilities there, and get more pad ready sites.
I think one of the things that we do, especially with transportation projects, is partner with the cities. Like, for example, when we did the reconstruction of 12, we we facilitated an important sewer connection that opened up a fairly substantial area for the city of Prior Lake. We also spent quite a bit of time working with the city of Shakopee as they started developing the West End, and that has some challenges from a sewer infrastructure and from a water infrastructure standpoint, and we've been trying to work with them in terms of how we require improvements to understand and kind of be sensitive to the obstacles that developers will have extending those utilities. So it's a really collaborative approach when it comes to that, and I think the paradigm has really changed for development over the last 2 decades with the change in the marketplace and financing, and so they have other obstacles that we need to be considerate of.
One thing I'll add on that is just to underscore again what Lisa had said earlier, that in certain areas, when there's a road construction or like 169 and 41, early on we started talking about getting fiber down into that area as a utility, so telecommunications, getting the providers to extend fiber further to the south from that intersection along that road line, so that businesses, if they locate there will be broadband available.
One last thing to add is that in some cases, like the city of Savage, we're starting to look at redevelopment opportunities and what do those businesses along Highway 13 potentially need, where we could theoretically move them to a different location that's better suited for outdoor storage or whatever it might be, and redevelop those areas for a better use, essentially, for where it's at. So that's another thing that we're looking at, coordinating with the cities and the county as well.
I think one thing that's different in Minnesota, or in particularly the metro area, compared to other places that I've been, is that the Met Council plays a big role in utility extension in the area of sewers. And I think one of the things that we learned in the past decade is that how you develop your orderly annexation plans depends on how they plan for expansions. And so I think Brad and I and others here at the county were kind of in a leadership role in figuring that out and helping the city understand that it was important about how you set up staging in your orderly annexation plans. Even though they were reluctant to do that, it was important for the regional facilities to get planned accordingly. So I think that's an area where we have collaborated and helped facilitate, but not necessarily had to provide those services.
Wonder if we could move to the audience for a few minutes. Are there questions from the audience? She just knows you're going to ask something.
Well, and this was kind of touched on before, and I know housing's next month, but what strikes me so much about, and really good information here, folks, I found very interesting, but it feels like we kind of have a perfect storm, or such a kind of critical touch point when you look at, so we have about 40% of our, 6% of our jobs, you can't afford an apartment here. We have already 47% of our residents that are renting are burdened by that, and we have a 1% vacancy rate. And it just feels like it's just such a critical kind of piece for the county, and I'm just trying to get a better handle on what's the county's role. There's some reference to the cities, and I kind of get that, but is there something as a county we can do to tackle this issue?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think you add on top of that even just some of the data that Lisa brought forward on the transportation part, the low usage on public transportation, and will potentially there be something that's done? Boy, if there's not housing here, if you take that away, that's a real problem then. So I think our big issues were just kind of creating awareness to the fact that this is out there, and how can we work and come alongside the cities to show that this is individuals that might be impacted by this, that are working full-time, that are pulling in a decent wage, but not a wage that's made them potentially able to purchase something within the county. So what are we going to do about that? How do we strategize around that? Because I think, like I mentioned, we've got some local employers that are pretty concerned about how are they going to get people here, and they can't even say that, oh, there's enough housing that's coming in the meantime, because it's a year or 2 years off. And so that's kind of a little bit of the alarm that we're hearing from some people. So I do think it's something we need to kind of rally around and try to figure out what we're going to do next.
And I would just reiterate, I think the education piece is huge. Residents don't understand necessarily what high-density housing means. They all have perceptions that it's only low income and people aren't working and they're all on, assistance, which just is not the case. And I think through the Live, Learn, Earn initiative, the housing work group has been working very hard on how do we raise the awareness around what the needs are, what it actually is, and how it fits into our community. So I think to continue doing that is definitely important in moving along to get what we need in the county.
I think one of the things that we need to think about, and I'm not sure exactly what the county's role is versus other entities, is, we probably can't just keep expanding transit service to sites, and so we need to somehow make sure that where we're infilling with housing, that it's in the right location if it's the type of housing that needs to have transit service to it. And there are tools out there that we don't currently have at the county, and I know that we'll probably talk about that more at the housing Scott delivers next month, but where potentially you could come in and write down the cost of land, because those areas where transit lines are probably are more expensive land in the county right now. And if you're trying to put affordable or workforce type housing in there, then the quality of the housing unit goes down because the price of land is so high, or it's just not feasible to even purchase that land for that purpose. So I think we need to find a way to bring the parties together to balance those components better.
One last thing for food for thought, as Michael, our county assessor, just sent me an email just within the last day or two talking about a really big housing development, multi-unit housing development that's coming in. And even if we could provide maybe some level of affordability for our senior population to move into something where they don't have to maintain their existing complement, their house, their yard, and some of the other factors that go with it. And if those affordable options exist for even our senior population, that would maybe even open up some of those the availability of homes that may be affordable at some level, or as they become available, is there a way for us to partner with the First Stop Shop and the CDA to help provide some incentive package to keep them affordable for our younger population? So it's, whether it is or is not something that we can succeed at least it should be in the back of our minds as these other senior centers are being built.
Madam Chair, can I turn it back to you for questions from the board, please?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful presentations. Colleagues, questions for the group? Yes, Commissioner Ellery.
Yes, I noticed the Live, Learn, Earn website for employers and potential employees to connect, and so forth. It's one thing to design a website. It's another thing to manage the data that goes in there. You design a website, you get all the stuff in there, and then you find probably that it takes half time, 3/4 time, or whatever time person to do that. I'm just wondering, I support Live, Learn, Earn engagement in that, but I just wonder if there's a way it could be housed with First Stop Shop at some point in the future. If that would make sense, I don't know. I don't see Live, Learn, Earn having an ongoing staff person, so that's one question. The other, I kind of do struggle with a couple things related to low-cost employers or low-wage paying employers. That's a more way to say it. How much obligation does the government have to make their business model work? Like, let's say X company, they pay $13, $14 an hour and they have thousands of employees. I think we need to push back on them and say, have you ever considered building workforce housing on your campus? I mean, the fact that we would make all these things available to them to make their business model work, the government doing that, I don't know, I question that. The other thing, and I got one more, and I'll be done. When we consider subsidizing or helping with some kind of aid to business coming in, I think a lot of times we've talked about how many employees at what wage, and we're so focused on the hourly wage. I would hope that we would more focus on the yearly income, because it doesn't do any good to say you're paying $25 an hour and they can only get 20 hours, or whatever it is. I know in our area we had a restaurant open, very popular restaurant, and heard, and I'm thankful to hear this, that they have like 93 new employees with the average wage being over $26 an hour for this restaurant. Well, then I wonder, can they get full time? So it's a question, But anyhow, so I threw out 3 things there to consider.
I'll take the website one.
I was going to say, so how about I kick
Okay.
off the website
Sounds
one and then
good.
you can follow up. So specific to the existing Live, Learn, Earn website that's out there, that was set up really at the beginning as a data warehousing site for the people who are involved in the Live, Learn, Earn groups. So it's not necessarily meant to be an outward facing to the public, here's what we're doing type site. It was more for managing documents for different meetings as we were going through those different working groups and coming up with what actions we wanted to focus on moving forward. But with that, we've now transitioned within a couple of our working groups to looking at creating a website.
Right, and I think right now we're at the exploration phase. We know that there's a few communities that have done something similar, so we're looking at how can we set this up so that the sustainability of this is something that hopefully isn't government paid for, that maybe our community is pitching in because there's such a desperate need for our local workforce. to make that connection. But I think you're right, like as far as how to house this, maintain this, and keep this up, we want to make sure that A, it's successful and it does what we intend it to do, and that B, it doesn't become some sort of a drain on any of our existing resources, that it only helps to support what's happening within the community. So still at the exploration phase of what we need to do with that, but I think there's a lot of smart people on that committee, so we're hopeful we'll come up with a solution for that. As far as being able to push back on employers, or I think competition right now, just within the labor force, is we're seeing an escalation in wages just due to some of that. And so I think always engaging in a conversation with employers about available options that are out there. But I just from my seat, or I think wouldn't want to make a recommendation of what they should do, but we have had some employers that have contacted us on what their competitors paying as a way to try to increase wages and be more competitive. But I think a good point. And I don't know, as far as the incentives.
So as far as the incentive packages go, when we're looking at the data that they're providing, and we've had some controversy over the topic of dollar per hour or annual wage level, and whether or not we should include part-time employees in their package as they're submitting it for consideration. Currently, we only look at full-time employees. However, a prior board was very interested in the supplemental wages for part-time employees and making sure that there was a large quantity of those available for those who don't want to work full-time or who do not have to have the income as a livable wage to support, but it's more of a supplemental. So with each board, there's a little bit different take on what should we be looking at and when does public subsidy come into play and when should it not. But currently in our contracts and the reporting that they have to do, again, we're anticipating that this data is accurate when we receive it, but it's only full-time employees with benefits is what we're looking at. So that is structured within all of our contracts as well.
Related to employers assisting with housing, and Brad can maybe help me out here a little bit too, but through the Resilient Communities project that the county is working on with the University of Minnesota, there is a project that's looking at employer-assisted housing. And what do those programs look like around the county? How might we be able to implement something like that here in Scott County? What types of employers make sense to reach out to try and make that happen? We're having conversations with SMSC to talk about, how we might be able to partner on some different ideas. So we are trying to look out of the box and see if there are ways that we can get employers more involved in housing conversations, particularly those that have those more entry-level type wages.
Commissioner Beard?
Well, Madam Chair, it's a huge subject with all kinds of hot buttons in it to talk about, and it would have been more fun to be engaged in an ongoing debate from the get-go instead of trying to collect thoughts and hold them to the very end. So rather than drop the plow way back at 9:15 and start from there, let me just make a couple high-level observations. One is I listened to the things that we talked about where my principles are in accord with what we're doing, and that's that government sets the stage. We build the infrastructure so people can create wealth. That's one thing I will quibble with in the whole presentation. Way back in the beginning, there was a slide that said something about our objective is to help create wealth. We don't create wealth. We build roads and we lay fiber and we do things that let people create wealth. The creativity and the growth and the productivity and prosperity of this county is embedded in the hearts and minds of the citizens of this county and the people who come here and invest their capital to do stuff. Make things, shingles, glass, bottles, print, whatever. They do stuff, and that's where the wealth comes from. We set the stage so they can do that. So I listened with fascination at the discussion about transportation, and I'll point out, just slightly chiding you, that no one mentioned the railroad system in this county. Very basic, very fundamental to an enormous amount of wealth and an enormous amount of high-paying jobs that exist in this county. They're here because the Union Pacific Railroad is connected to both coasts and to the international markets. Just an observation. As we talk land use planning, you'll want to protect that because we can't continue to build schools, apartment buildings, and strip malls next to the railroad right-of-way and expect that asset to be there for our grandkids. We have to remember to protect that right-of-way and to protect or access to the railroad. A second one is the airports. We have no commercial or public use airports in this county. We rely on the Metropolitan Airport Commission for Air Lake Airport on the east and Flying Cloud Airport just across the river. That may not be on anybody's radar, no pun intended, but to the corporate campuses that locate here, the really high-paying jobs, that's a big deal. Access to Flying Cloud and Air Lake Airport. And maybe to an extent down in the southwest corner of the county, Le Sueur or Mankato. Just know that those are out there and we don't have any. So we should probably have some sort of a tether to the Metropolitan Airport Commission or to the adjacent counties that actually have it. Some of them that are out of our control have to do with the utilities that I think Perry mentioned. The cost of accessing the Metropolitan Waste Commission is getting to be a real problem. And in that case, we're all in the same swamp together. It's not like Scott County has an advantage over Hennepin. Metropolitan Waste Commission is what it is, and it just costs a lot of money to treat sewage. But we may want to pay attention to that as that unfolds in the future. I could go on and on about the cost of housing and low-income housing. Cindy referenced the ability for people to live in their homes when we're older. I heard a statistic somewhere recently in one of these kind of meetings that 40% of the housing in Shakopee is under $200,000. 40% of the living units in Shakopee are under $200,000. The problem is people like Karen and Mike Beard live in them, and we're not moving anytime soon. So trying to pry those people like me out of those so that our grandkids can afford to buy our place and live here is an issue. I think things like we did with up on Holmes and just down the street here with the HRA, CDA, I mean, that sold out and filled up in a hurry with people like me selling out of our $180,000 homes so that other kids can buy those affordable units that are already here, already sitting in our neighborhoods in Shakopee, and I'm sure it's the same in Savage and Jordan and Belle Plaine too. And the cost of housing going up is one that I don't think this working group can even begin to approach when it comes to taxes and building codes and things that are happening that just continue to drive up the cost. But it's nice to know we're aware of it, but again, I kind of step back and think, is that really a core function of government? Core function of government to find people places to live? I'd love to debate that more, but not this morning. I guess I'm not asking for any answers, I just some observations as I listen to the discussion.
Thinking of writing an offer on your home.
Thank you,
Might
Commissioner
be
Beard.
unhappy about that.
Could I maybe provide one just comment
Yes,
back on that?
please.
So one of the things that we're hearing, which is kind of interesting and I think is worth maybe finding out some more about, is that we've been talking a lot about senior housing. And typically senior housing is rental housing. But we've heard from a lot of seniors who say, I don't want to leave my house and move into something where I have to rent it. I want to purchase something that's not totally out of my budget, but it's mine, it's my property to own. And we don't have any of that. So that's definitely an opportunity, I think, for something that we could look at where maybe that would encourage some of our seniors to move out of those homes and into a different place where their homes would become available for less money.
Madam Chair, Commissioner Ulrich is chiding me. My illustration was for illustration purposes only. Nobody's going to buy it. Yeah. But you know, if you want to get into the story about how we ended up there, we can talk about affordable housing and personal responsibility, but that's another discussion.
Next time. Thank you, Commissioner. Comments or questions? Commissioner Beard.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we are going to talk about housing next month, right? Okay, good.
yes.
You save the story.
Yeah, that'll be good. It'll be good. So I have two hot buttons when it comes to this. One's the fiber. I love that we have that infrastructure and that the county bears that burden on the levy, but it impacts in a positive way our taxpayers. We all are digging in the same well. That we've saved school districts a ton of dough, technical term. Cities, a ton of dough, I'm looking at Perry, but I love that. Now bear with me, I'm trying to make a point here. So we have this fiber, we've had it for a while. My question as it comes to economic development, is it still in that window of new, exciting, hot, sexy, or are we moving to it's a bowl of vanilla ice cream? Good, but everyone has it. Is it still, I'm looking at Stacy and Perry, is the iron still hot on fiber as it pertains to maybe attracting Silicon Prairie type companies, or is it just sort of expected to have it as infrastructure?
Sure, I'll start. Well, I would always choose hot and sexy over vanilla. And so I do think that fiber actually is becoming even sexier. I think policymakers such as yourself are becoming even more aware of the impact of broadband. Developers are starting to be more astute in driving broadband to the properties that they're building, because they're recognizing it's just as important as any other utility like electricity or water. And so I think communities just in general are starting to become more aware. We'll be putting an article in the Scott County Scene this next edition to try to create even more awareness. And so I think from businesses, I get a lot of calls from residents out in the county that are underserved, but I think businesses are starting to really expect in a commercial area that it should be there as a utility. But that's just my take.
And I would say generally speaking, we still hear about a lot of different counties throughout the state who are striving to have something. They don't have something like Scott County has yet. So Scott County was very forward thinking in coming up with the ring. And I think now the trick is, how do we best utilize it to attract the types of businesses that we want to attract, and how do we actively use it to start reaching out to those technology type companies and make sure that the integration is seamless and that it's not a big obstacle to overcome just to get them hooked up to it. So I think those are discussions that we're starting to have, and some things that we're starting to look into as we move forward.
Well, for me, it's one of those things that I guess makes me hyperventilate a little bit, like our opportunity to capture that as a competitive advantage for commercial business. It feels like that window is, as time goes on, is closing. I don't know. I hope that's not the case. I hope it at least is vanilla with some sprinkles on it or something that is a competitive advantage to attract. I don't know what slide it is here, that the delta between, hey, we've got all of these trained folks, but the job doesn't match up. So that's just one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night. The second is, and Stacy and I, we've talked about this every time I bug you when I'm at City Hall. It feels like our canvas has kind of been painted as, hey, you're looking for a place to build a big square or rectangular building with very little windows. We got a place for you, a lot of them. Changing that dynamic of, hey, yeah, we have those and we've got a lot of them, but there's also other opportunities, and that's where I see that fiber as a potential of these high-paying jobs. It doesn't always have to be the big companies. If Mickey were here, she sat at this table before, kind of advocating for small businesses that have really high-paying jobs. I think the mayor of Prior Lake was around here or is here, and they're really focused on trying to diversify their tax base with commercial growth. So those things, it feels like that window's closing, and we need to repaint the canvas and drive the conversation. And then brokers get it in their mind that, Shakopee, I call it the 4 R's: rail, road, rivers, and airports. Didn't we use arithmetic for R back in the olden days? I know we're set up for all of those distribution type places, but that also serves other businesses as well. So how do we best maximize that window while it's still open to change the conversation? I know brokers like really expensive gifts, which is here and there, but
We won't go there. But one of the things that we are talking about, the post-secondary presence in the county helps to open up kind of that idea that maybe the county is more open to the innovation type jobs and entrepreneurship. And the whole idea of this innovation center is something that I think would help to change the perception of Scott County if we can capitalize on the residents that we have here to take advantage of that service being offered in the county.
All right, thank you all for your comments. I'll submit some email comments because I think we're out of time for this portion of the agenda. I want to thank everybody for this presentation. What really strikes me most is I'm just so happy and proud. I have no reason to be proud that all of you from all of these different departments and entities are looking at this and working on this together. And so far in my experience in this world of government, we're doing a great job on getting out of those silos, getting out of those departments, and I'm glad because it's everybody's, if this is an initiative, it's everybody's responsibility, and so I thank you for that especially, and thank you for the presentation. We'll now recess for 5 minutes.